All right, welcome back to Sketchy Talk. This is our 13th episode, and we are happy to have Virginia Hein today. Virginia Hein is an artist, author, and art instructor from Los Angeles, California. She counts herself lucky to have worked as an artist in one form or another throughout her life. As a concept and character designer for toys and entertainment, art director, illustrator, and teacher. She taught drawing to aspiring toy designers at Otis College of Art and Design for 13 years, and now focuses on teaching sketching workshops at Descanso Gardens and other locations. She has been an active member of the International Community of Urban Sketchers since 2009 and has been honored to teach workshops at 4 International Urban Sketchers Symposiums and will be teaching at the upcoming symposium in Auckland, New Zealand. She has contributed her work to a number of books and other publications about location sketching. Her book, 5-Minute Sketching Landscapes, was published by Rotovision in 2017, and she co-authored the Urban Sketching Handbook Spotlight on Nature with Corey Books in 2022 with Gail L. Long. Virginia received an MFA in drawing and painting from California State University, Long Beach, where she also taught watercolor painting. Virginia considers drawing to be her first language and continues to find drawing and a path of discovery and joy. This is also what I love to teach. I like to encourage the attitude of the experiment. It shifts the mindset from succeeding or failing to focus instead on what can be learned from the experience. This is the best antidote I know for overcoming fear. If I can open the doors a bit with encouragement, it is exciting to see the growth and progress that is made and acknowledge it. Welcome, Virginia.
Thank you. Happy to talk to you.
And I love this attitude because with my students, I work mostly with illustration and sequential art students, but I always really encourage sketching because I always tell them that execution of illustration is part of it, but your solutions are the most important part of being an professional artist, but being an illustrator or designer, and even in all of those disciplines, it's your ideas that you're most being paid for.
That's true. I agree 100%. And teaching drawing to toy designers, I always felt, and I would tell them this, you guys have amazing ideas. And I would see this consistently, just brilliant ideas. But, drawing is a language and they would need, say, more refinement in that language in order to make the ideas clear. And I always said, it's not about how you draw or your particular style. It's how do you get your ideas across? And so that's actually, I don't think, so different from teaching, I teach adults sketching on location, and it might seem very different. I mean, in some ways, the goal is very different. I always was hoping to help my students at Otis get jobs, but I also wanted to just encourage them, to kind of let go of some of that, the having to just get there and enjoy the process. And when you're teaching sketching, that's all about that. It's all about that. And yes, it's great if we have a beautiful outcome, but I always think you have a more higher chance of beautiful outcomes when you kind of let go of that in the process and just if you're absolutely enjoying the process. And that may sound easy, but we know that takes a lot of time and practice to get to.
Definitely. It is an ongoing journey, starting from wherever you begin your practice to, I don't want to say where you end up, but there are a lot of detours that one takes, in any art career.
Absolutely.
And that is a good segue. I'd like to know, you worked for years at Mattel. We were talking before I started recording. I've worked with a lot of toy companies. My background is in industrial design, and I ended up, especially with my recent career, mostly doing illustration. I still occasionally do an industrial design. I think the last industrial design project I worked on was designing handles for fishing poles, which was
Okay.
very interesting. It was really cool.
Sure.
I mean,
Mhm.
I love doing industrial design projects. I worked on a lot of stuff for California companies like Wild Planet and, a lot of companies that aren't here anymore. But you had worked with Mattel. What was your journey? Did you go to school for industrial design?
Not at all. Was learn while you earn. I really came into Mattel more with Illustrator an
Oh, interesting.
illustration kind of. I had been working in advertising, doing mainly illustration, and that was kind of was my job while I was in graduate school. That kind of continued, and getting very dissatisfied with it. And a good friend said, "Do you ever?" I was looking for a job, and he said, "Do you ever re look at the business section?" I thought, "Why would I do that?" He says, "Well, because there's an ad for Mattel in the business section, and they're looking for art directors." And I guess my immediate thought was, "Well, I don't know if I could do that." And he said, "Well, you won't know until you try, do you?" I never forgot this, of course, as you can tell. And it's true. I went and I interviewed
Ho-
and I actually started with
Hold on just a second.
sure,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead. Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, no
I'll
problem.
have to cut this out. We have someone, a friend staying with us. He sold his house really fast a couple months ago because he got hired by Disney, and he's designing product design for all the parks. And they wanted him to move to Florida, but now they're not sure if they need to move to Florida, and he's had trouble finding a house. So he's
Oh,
been living with me and my husband while he's figuring out where he's going.
wow.
Which I'll edit this out. But anyway, continue on, and I'll just cut it together.
Okay, now think where I know I was probably going off on a tangent, so I'll
No
try to
worries,
reel it
no
in.
worries. That's
In
what
any event,
podcasts are for.
I did end up going to Mattel. I started actually doing packaging, graphics, or art directing, really, and so but I thought the people who are doing something really interesting are the concept designers, the product designers. I want to do that. And I was very fortunate, I feel, that after about a year, I transitioned to that area and I did that for many years. I've at first working for Mattel, I worked in San Francisco, actually came back to Mattel, and then left in the late 90s and was a freelancer for a number of years. So I worked for Hasbro. I worked for all different companies as a freelancer. But I think when I discovered that what was really fun was drawing and invention, and with toy design, I got to sort of combine those. Of course, you're always working either with a client or someone who has the last word. You usually don't have the last word when you're working in a in-house situation or you're working as a hired illustrator, but I still got so much joy just from doing the invention, doing any kind of invention. In often case, it was in a team setting, which
Mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
discovered I enjoyed, which I had no idea I would. So when you talk about the different detours, I discovered a lot of things I would not have known that I would really enjoy. And I always found it came down to if I could draw, I almost didn't care. Well, that's almost didn't care what I was drawing. It could be a troll, literally. It could
Mm-hmm.
be, anything. And if I could just enjoy the process of figuring it out, thinking about the story, and just drawing, I could get a lot of pleasure from that. And it's something that I think carried me through all kinds of jobs. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I did things that were not so much product design oriented the way you did them, but I worked in a lot of different areas that it was always that the invention, the story, and the drawing that were the fun parts. And that still is true, I think, even though it's been since 2016 since I actually was doing that for a living. Since then, I've
Mm-hmm.
been teaching and just, doing my own stuff.
It is all very interrelated. And I always feel like, and I don't know, obviously, when you're teaching urban sketching, that's sort of a different creative brief than when you're teaching college students that are wanting to get a
Yeah,
job. But I think that a lot of the things that you need to be able to be good at are overlap each other.
absolutely. But I also tried to, in some ways, I was the person that would tell them, in my class, I'm at least as interested in how you get there, your process, your thought process, your drawing
Mm-hmm.
process as your outcome. In your other classes where you have to produce something to show, as a finished product, that may not that may be more the focus, but in my class I really want you to just relax a little bit and just get into the process. And honestly, a lot of what they did for my class would go into their portfolios because something that employers were often looking for. They didn't want to just see beautiful, and especially now where everything is done digitally
Of course.
as a fin, and so you don't always know what went into that. And I think a lot of employers even still would want to see what was your thought process. Well, they could produce, here's my drawings, here's the where I went with this, here's all my character ideation. And
Hmm.
so that's that idea that the more you do, you can only get better was true there, and it's true when it comes to teaching sketching. The people who get excited after class and go home and keep practicing, wow, they just accelerate their own progress light years
Hmm.
because they got excited by something or interested enough in something that they wanted to keep. Where can I take this? So,
Hmm.
in a funny way, those same things are markers for success, I believe. Well, the success may look different, but I think there's a satisfaction that people get when they can see their own progress.
So it says you started working with the Urban Sketchers in 2009. Did you have a sketching practice before then? Have you always sort of doodled in sketchbooks? Because your journey to working at Mattel seems like it was more from an artistic, I don't want to say artistic, but more from a drawing perspective than from, say, going to school for industrial design.
Right.
And so did you work on your own concepts before that?
No, not so much concepts, but I always drew. I
Mm-hmm.
always drew, partly from imagination, partly from observation. But I think at a certain point, I felt like my work was getting a little stale. I had a studio at one time, painting studio, but it's funny. It might have been right around 2007. I just had an inspiration to just start working from location, just being very go outside the studio, just start drawing. And it was just something that caught fire. And sometimes when you make a decision, things start to appear. I'm not the first one to
Exactly.
say this, of course, but I started seeing blogs. I started seeing things about people who are doing this. And it must have been right about maybe end of 2008, 2009, that the light came on when I found the Urban Sketchers website and I contacted Gabby Campanario, and I just thought it was like, wow, look at this. This is really, this people are out there doing this thing that felt really new and different for me, but that there were people, all kinds of people, literally all over the world in very different styles. And I've I have I'm just not fond of organizations, shall we say, where everybody kind of paints in a similar style. Not for
Yes.
me. What I loved about Urban Sketchers is there was absolutely no rules about that. It was an attitude that was important, the being true to what you were seeing in your own style. That just rang all the bells for me, and that there was no hierarchy about that. I
Mm-hmm.
just love
Mm-hmm.
that as well. So I got pretty excited about that, and it became something I started doing absolutely with a passion. So this thing that I had been mainly doing on vacations or just
Mm-hmm.
sort of here and there became a daily practice.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I guess I became a correspondent with the Urban Sketchers blog, I think late in 2009.
Oh,
And
wow.
so
Uh-huh.
that was and then I think there weren't as many local organizations. Well, there was the sketch crawls. That was kind of a thing, and that
Mm-hmm.
was going on in Los Angeles with my friend Shiho Nakaza had
Uh-huh.
was leading that. But I think where we started to see the symposium. I think the first symposium was, gosh, when was it? I didn't go to that one, but a lot of things started to accelerate very quickly with Urban Sketchers, and it started to get bigger and bigger. But
Mm-hmm.
so I just sort of fell into it maybe just at the perfect time.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I had like a burning need to do and discovered that it was a lot of other people were being fired up about the same thing.
Did you when you started, did you find that it was an antidote to getting burnt out?
Oh
I mean,
gosh,
that's what
yes,
I've found it like
absolutely.
when I started. I mean, I do so many book illustrations, and not that I don't love them, but it kind of reminds me why I love drawing, because it's sort of no stakes. It's not for a client. It doesn't have to be super finished. And that's
Exactly.
the thing I love the most about it. And now
Mhm.
you're even seeing there's a drawing, I guess, studio that's very close to where I live, and they actually even have drawing as mindfulness as a class, which I think is
Uh-huh.
really interesting.
That's a
Because
new interesting thing I'm seeing very strongly, and I that's very interesting. Yeah,
yeah, and I think that there's something to that where it's sort of, again, more being interested in the process rather than the result.
absolutely. I mean, a lot of the things that I teach, especially when it comes to drawing, I've never called it that, but what I really relish the most, what I love the most is that very focused connection when I'm so focused on what I'm drawing and there's a solid connection between what I'm seeing, what my hand is doing, what I'm feeling,
Mm-hmm.
uh, what I'm thinking. The tool becomes an extension of that, and I'm able to really just feel what the tool wants to do. And as it hits the paper, I mean, there's like a circle I see there. It's like, it's just a total focused connection that when I'm that focused, when I stop drawing, it's like, yeah, I'm aware that I'm coming out of not a trance, but I'm coming out of a state, I guess, sort of
Yes.
an altered state. So I've never thought of it as something strictly, I've never applied that word mindfulness to it, but I do think that's what's going on. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what's so enjoyable to me. And so that's not an easy thing to teach, but I think if you can get people to relax enough to allow that process, that's where the lights come on. I really believe. And when you start to feel what you're doing, and I think if people have difficulty with that, try something else, try another practice or another tool or another way of doing it. And I think you have to find that place of a real connection and enjoyment.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed that you also your other book is 5 minute sketching landscapes, and I actually do a lot of timed sketching with my students, and I started doing that because I noticed when I time them, the stuff I got was actually better than when I send them home for a couple days and they come back with sketches. There's something about that reflexive drawing that
Hmm.
happens, and I was wondering if you've noticed the same thing. And
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well, here's the caveat I had about the book was that, well, not everything you see in this book was done in 5 minutes, but I will tell you that the first 5 minutes are the most important. So whether
yes.
you're doing literally a 5 minute sketch, and I have been doing those again lately because I do see exactly what you're saying, is it's just you dive in.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to do that with Otis students with thumbnail sketching where they had to do
Mm-hmm.
an idea and I always loved saying, okay, look what you just came up with in 5 minutes. And I think
Exactly.
everybody would be a kind of surprised how quickly ideas happen. And so when it comes to, say, sitting down in a location, the first 5 minutes where I decide what is it I want to sketch, what do I want to include, what do I how do I see how do I compose the space, and so it's instantly you're leaving that mind that wants to figure it all out to just organizing the shapes. What are the lines? What's the tool? And so I think that connection, between the tool and the hand and the subject and what you're drawing all happens so quickly. And so it's a spontaneous thing. And yeah, there's something very exciting about that. And I love to see that it proves to people that they can actually do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there is a, I mean, I always time myself when I'm out sketching. If I know I have
Mhm.
45 minutes, I might, time it in 10-minute increments or 15-minute increments or something like that, just to have certain benchmarks. And I found that there's something about that psychologically that gets you through it faster, if that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense. Yep.
But it's fascinating. So how did you come up with uh the I suppose is the right word, the outline for the book, like the whole philosophy behind it?
Uh,
Was it just from your own
oh,
experiences, or?
well, the 5-minute sketching, that was part of a series. And I don't know
Yes.
if you've seen, so Liz Steele
I
in the
have a
first,
couple of the books from that.
yeah, I think there's only four, as far as I know,
Hmm.
maybe there's five, but the first two, Pete Scully did one on people
Hmm.
and Liz, and I was a contributor to Liz's book. And so the format was, I believe, pretty much set by the publisher. It was a very tight format as far as, even the page layouts
Hmm.
roughly, and how many words and
Yes,
things like
yes.
that you might think in one way that seems so limiting. But quite frankly, the time frame was really short. And
Hmm.
so it helped to have, okay, I know that I'm going to have 5 sections to the book, but I got to, decide what did I think was the most important thing. So, I mean, the
Hmm.
content was what I got to create. I was asked to do it on landscapes. So
Hmm.
and I had I was able to see what Liz had done. And so I thought, well, obviously, I don't want to duplicate what someone else did, but we're going to follow the same format. That's the brief, you might say.
Hmm.
And in some ways, that made it easier. And of course, it was challenging, but it's, just like a 5-minute sketch is challenging when you have to get something into five of something and has so
Yes.
many this. And so, yeah, that in some ways made it easier. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's kind of setting the parameters.
Hmm. Yeah, that's always it's sometimes nice when you have a creative brief when you're working on a project like that. And that's one thing that getting students used to, especially when you were teaching the toy design class, that a lot of times you're working in parameters. I think that that's perhaps one of the toughest lessons to teach different students is like illustration, for example. A lot of times it's not like just I mean, you have to work within size limitations, die limitations, if you've done packaging art, if you've done
Oh,
any
yes.
type of thing. And learning to work within those is probably one of the biggest challenges. And so what are you teaching in New Zealand?
I am teaching a workshop called The Dance of Line and Color,
Oh,
which is my
nice.
favorite subject. And I've
Uh-huh.
taught it, quite frankly, in various forms in the past. And I think I finally hit on the expression, the dance of line and color. And to me, it just fit perfectly because I like to say that line and color are very, very different components. And I mean, how many urban sketchers do we know that actually work with ink and watercolor? A whole bunch. It's
Exactly, yeah.
almost the common language. But I really want to rethink that, and feel that differently and think about that differently and really look at how can I be expressive with line? What am I doing with line that I can't do with anything else? And what kind of line, and really, so it's in some ways it's focusing on the line, but then when we go to color, what is it that color brings? What
Mm-hmm.
is it that color brings to the story? And they're not always used in equal measure. There may be a drawing where line tells most of the story and color just comes in and boom, just gives that emotional punch, or it may give that illusion of depth that the line drawing didn't have. And it can
Mm-hmm.
be done so loosely and so simply if the drawing itself tells most of the story, or if I only want to just use enough line to suggest the skeleton or the basic architecture, and then more of the story is probably told with color. I just personally don't love to do a lot of detail with color. I love to let color be a little more loose and free.
Mm-hmm.
So, I like just seeing those two things as complementary players or dancers, and one of
Mm-hmm.
them leads, and they may take turns. It's not always one that leads. Maybe they take turns leading, just like good partnerships so often do. So that's what I'm really focusing on. It's like seeing the two components together come and make something fresh.
So what has been the evolution of your technique? So when you started picking it up in 2009, how did you approach? Were you working more traditionally is not probably the right word. What were you working more with black line when you first started? And then I noticed your most recent sketches, you're working with sort of a color line with added color, which is and you do have a very expressive line too. So what has been your evolution to that technique?
I think I've always loved line. I've always loved drawing, and I think I never for years felt as confident with color.
Hmm.
Line was like what I just did naturally, and color was like something I'm still always learning about. And of course, all of it is always a learning process. But I think when I started working on location, I started buying boxes of these pens from, I don't remember the brand, but they were cheap pens I bought by the box at Staples
Oh
that
yeah.
were waterproof. That was the magic, right? So once they dry, they are waterproof. And then I have a little travel set of watercolors. In fact, now it's over 30 years old. It's been all over the world, and so I would use that little travel set of watercolors. But I would do a drawing in with this cheap pen, and for maybe a couple of years, that was all I used until, the community of urban sketchers has a lot of we love sharing our supplies. And I remember when I saw drawings from Tia in Singapore and Don Lowe, and they were using something called a Fude pen. And I thought that was pure magic because it's a calligraphy pen, very expressive. And I would notice how they would use it, in a very calligraphic way, which I just admired so much. And so that's something I started to play with. A lot of people love the Lamy Safari, and I played a bit with that. But my real love was that Fude pen because it just could be so expressive in the way you would move it and do things with it. Uh, and so that's really what I worked with for a long time. And so I just always love experimenting. So I started working on color grounds. And when I work on a color paper, I would start working with gouache. And
Hmm.
it's funny, I mean, I had worked with gouache in school and thought it was just awful. But
Hmm.
then I turned it around to say, well, you don't have to do it the way you did it in school. You can figure out how you want to use it. I use it with watercolor combined. Basically, as you know, you throw white gouache into the mix and you basically turn all your paints opaque. So I started playing with making my own color grounds and, playing with different things. That's fairly recent with the color line because uh, I started, I got the brass nib pen, the Japanese brass nib pen, Kakamori, and took a little bit of a learning curve, just the way Fude pens did. But with the Kakamori ink, which has a heavier body, I know such a nerd right now, but that's okay.
No, no, that's
So
so
I
interesting.
I just am such an art supply nerd. So what I discovered is it just brought something new. And once it dries, it's a pigment ink, so it takes longer to dry. But once it dries, it's more permanent. But like working with a stick or a bamboo pen, it's less controlled. So it's can be very, very clunky and heavy, and you just kind of work with that. But I do love the color line, and because it's like setting yourself a new challenge. If you draw with a color line, totally changes everything in terms of color. You
Hmm.
can't use it to create the darkest dark like you would with a black pen. So it's always being on a learning edge, I guess. And I think
Hmm.
some of my drawings with a color pen are god awful. And every once in a while I have one that I think, wow, I'm kind of happy with that because, it's so yeah, I say take the attitude of experiment with everything, but it's hard to not have a have an expectation or a hope for the outcome. That's just how we are. So,
Hmm.
but if I'm really hating the outcome, I kind of put it, I tell students to do this too, put it away. Don't
Hmm.
look at it for a while. Okay, get it out later and try to look objectively and say, well, what works? What is it I wish I had done differently or will do next time? Don't dwell on the past, but what would I
Hmm.
do next time a little differently? And I always say, overdoing it is how you learn. So don't ever be afraid of overdoing it because, you're gonna find out something that way.
And I have had the same experience with gouache. I used it in college, and you know, I it was okay, but I didn't love it. And most of my children's books have been painted in acrylic, and then I've done a couple in watercolor, and the latest one I'm doing is in gouache because I like but I'm not using gouache in a pure, I don't ever use any materials in a purist form.
Right, right.
So I don't know how archival they are because, I'll add a little bit of acrylic if I've always, actually a color, a paint that I fell in love with a couple of years ago, and actually I discovered it at a symposium, was the core watercolors because I love how bright they are.
Mm-hmm.
And they work with golden acrylics, which were the paints that I painted with most of the time. And a lot of times I use golden, the opaque black and white because they're pretty strong. And so it really makes things opaque. So even the opaque white for gouache is not opaque enough compared to the golden. And so I've been kind of mixing that in. So I don't know if like in a few years all the art all the art will kind of crack off the Bristol or what will happen. Hopefully I'll have it scanned in before then.
Right.
But
Just in case.
I don't know like the permanence of gouache when it's mixed with a little watercolor or a little, because sometimes the gouache colors aren't intense enough, and so I throw a little watercolor into them, and I don't know if how long they'll last. I mean, as an illustrator, it doesn't matter as much, but if someone buys an original painting, you don't know if it will last or not.
Well, I know they're both water-based paints, and I think a lot
Hmm.
of artists now, anyway, do mix watercolor and gouache. That they
Hmm.
don't see them as that different. It's just a level of opacity. I mean,
Hmm.
when it comes to acrylic, I don't know because it is a water soluble pigment, but hey, you'll find out.
Yes, I don't, like I said, I don't
Uh,
know how long those pieces will last, but it's sort of whatever effect you're trying to get, you use the paint that gets that effect.
yep.
And so it's been kind of interesting. I am enjoying how the colors are mixing together, which is a little bit different from, obviously when acrylic is dry, it's dry. So it's actually great for doing grounds like you've described, depending on
Yes.
what you want it to do, if you want it to actually pick up the paint or if you want it not to pick up the paint.
Right.
And so a lot of times I'll even paint, this book takes place all at night, so been painting a lot of pages with a thin layer of acrylic blue so that it doesn't pull up the paint when I paint on top of it. But yeah, it's all different experimentation.
Well, that's where the enjoyment is, right?
Yes, yes. Now, are there art supplies you've tried that you did not enjoy sketching with or illustrating with?
Well, the only thing that comes to mind, maybe I'm one of those people that never met an art supply I didn't like, but that very slick paper, like
Uh-huh.
the Yupo, I know there's people who seem to love it and do wonderful things with it, but that did not work for me at all.
Oh, interesting.
I like seeing, I love things that have a little bit of absorbency or,
Mm-hmm.
but that where everything just sort of sat on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
No, that did not work for me. That's about the only thing I can think of that have no use for. So,
Mm-hmm.
maybe I need to go back and give it another try, but not anytime soon, probably.
Yeah, I've never been like, the only materials I don't really feel comfortable using a lot is pastels and color pencils a little bit. I seem to get a lot of illustration students that want to illustrate in color pencils, and there's people I know that are really wonderful with them, but that is a material that I've never felt comfortable doing a lot of illustration in.
Well, it's very time intensive.
I
I
think
mean,
that's why, like for urban sketching it, but there are people that use it and do a
oh,
great job.
absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe it's just, and I've always disliked stuff that has a lot of dust, like
Well, that's
pastels
why
and
you
stuff like
don't like
that.
pastels, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. But I see people do extremely amazing work with them and charcoals and stuff. And I guess that's one of the things. Everybody has their own unique way of working.
Hmm.
And and then you get your favorite papers, and hopefully they'll keep producing. That's one thing. I'm wondering if your career, if there's been supplies you've loved that they stopped making, because that's always been a difficulty with a lot of artist friends that I've had, is their favorite art supply, they stop making it. Like they stop making the paper or they stop making the
Huh.
pens.
I can't think of anything. The only thing there's been things that like, oh, where I'll see something that makes a nice heavy duty craft brown paper. Oh, there was a like a can't think of it, but anyway, like a photo album type paper
Yes.
that I saw and I started using, and that went away. But then Cottonwood came along and started doing one that I like just as much. So
Uh,
I can't think of anything that I haven't been able to replace or just use differently.
uh Yeah, I've noticed like some papers sometimes as probably as they source different things. Like I use different Bristols and illustration boards, and some of them have changed in quality over the years. So
Yeah,
sometimes it's
you
not
do
that they even
notice that,
discontinue.
sure.
Yeah, the way that they make them, and there's some certain types of paints that friends of mine have used over the years that they no longer make. I think it's what you're seeing is a lot of stuff that was tied to commercial illustration is going away because people don't use them anymore, like
Makes
Luma
sense.
dyes and stuff like that
Okay.
are disappearing because they're kind of like letraset,
Right. But
uh,
on
dry
the other
lettering.
hand, I feel like there's so much. I mean, every time I go
Yes,
into an art supply store, there's like, I've never seen that before. I mean, to me, there's so much that because there's so many more people out sketching, I
yes,
see, there was a time you didn't go into an art supply store and see 20 different kinds of sketchbooks. You just didn't see that. And I feel like there's so much now. I've been a little concerned I'm not seeing panorama books out there as much lately, and I'm not sure why, because I know a lot of people like them, but then a
hmm
lot of people are making their own. So, but really for the most part, like watercolor markers suddenly appeared just when, the commercial use of markers, the way we used them for renderings at one time,
yes.
that's kind of gone
I
away.
remember those days.
Oh gosh, yes. But now there's all these different kinds of watercolor markers and things like that that didn't even exist because they're perfect for doing, on location sketching. So I
Hmm
do feel like art supply companies have tried to keep up with the fact that there's so many people out there, and gouache, for heaven's sake. I mean, gouache is something that so many people are using now that there's as you know, there's hybrids of acrylic and gouache, and there's new companies are coming out with gouache that didn't do that before. So I think the companies are trying to keep up with what we are out there doing.
I think that you are seeing an increase in traditional materials because, and I think part of it might even, for one thing, I think more people are getting into sketching as a practice. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think part of it is before they had a name for it, sketching as mindfulness. I think that it is a great way to spend time not only increasing skills, but I think there's something peaceful about it that is really appealing. And that's why it's exploding. It engages you in a way that's very different than other practices.
Oh, 100%. I totally agree with you.
And I think that that's why you're seeing so many people picking it up as a hobby. And I think it has been neglected a lot as schools get rid of, and I don't know what the situation is in California, but I know a lot of schools in Ohio have been getting rid of art programs and drawing programs in their uh, public schools.
Sadly, I believe that is the case. I had students who came into Otis and were in my classes and would tell me we didn't have art in high school. I
Hmm
just would be stunned. Why? But that's not so uncommon unless you were, I meet AP students, kids who were able to focus on that. But some schools seem to be strong in that. And if you just happen to be at a school that didn't have that, or
hmm
didn't value that, oh well. So it's not everybody is getting it the way they did at one time.
hmm I mean, we've talked. I mean, I've talked on before on Sketchy Talk about how important drawing is, even if you think you're not good at it, which I think is a very that's one thing I love about urban sketchers is their manifesto saying it doesn't matter how good you are as long as you're
Exactly.
sketching. And so
Exactly.
many people are afraid to at first get into something that they're not going to be able to monetize or make it
Yes.
as a profession, which
Right.
I think like with art and with music, I think that there are a lot of things that you can attribute to it that are good for your health beyond being ways to make money. And I think
Right.
that it's so important for everybody in any discipline to learn how to, like, being able to communicate visually is a skill that I think should be taught to everyone, even if you're drawing on a napkin. Like it's a type of communication that perhaps is not recognized enough as a way to, I mean, look at how many people use emojis. I know this is a crude
Yeah,
comparison, but that just shows how much a graphical representation of something
very true. Yeah,
communicates better than words sometimes.
I know. I use emojis, and that's why. So I
Yeah,
totally
because the
get that.
text could be
Yeah.
the text could be vague.
Well,
And
are you familiar with Betty Edwards? I mean, she was kind of a pioneer in the idea of that everybody can learn to draw. And she's the one that wrote the book Drawing on the Right Side of the
I
Brain.
thought yes, I thought I
Yes.
recognized her name.
Yeah. And I saw her when I was in college.
Oh
And
wow.
yes, she came to speak at my school. And once again, light bulb moments. And it explained a lot to me. And, because I had been drawing for forever and
Hmm.
I had always noticed that some people just seem to take to it naturally, and other people, if they didn't seem to just take it up, they would just say, "Oh, that's not for me. I don't have talent." All those things I'm talking about. And she just sort of turned that on its head, literally. And uh, not everybody agrees with her, but I thought she was absolutely brilliant because she took the attitude, literally, everyone can learn to draw. And people would say, "Well, do you mean everybody's going to turn into a Michelangelo?" And she'd say, "Listen, everybody knows how to write or should know how to write. It doesn't make them a Hemingway." So, no, that's not what I'm saying. And I always thought that was really brilliant. But there was a lot of things that she did as to sort of help people shift out of the trying to figure it out, trying to sort of give it a name. And literally, she would have people turn something upside down so that they would just see shapes. So there's so many things like that that I think she did that were really brilliant. And she would
Hmm.
say, I always noticed that if I were doing a demo with my students, I couldn't talk. Like they asked me a question, I'd have to stop what I was doing. And I'd always noticed that, and I had not put that together. And, she says, we do know from the research about the left and right sides of the brain, they do not operate independently. But there are certain things, like what we call that altered state or mindfulness when
Hmm.
you're drawing, that's not a word state. And so when you sort of shift out of that, it's literally is a shift.
Yes,
So
yes.
many things that she said, I still remember. I mean, this is back when I was in graduate school 100 years ago, but it just is so vivid to me because it made things make sense to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's something about observation, like even if you're not drawing it well, that I mean, everybody's read the stories where they're starting to have science classes have drawing in them because, like, if you're observing something in biology, like if you're looking at a plant or something, if you draw it, you actually remember it better than if you take notes
Absolutely.
about it.
Oh, I love hearing that. That's great.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's because your brain processes, and that's part of there's a sort of co-movement to urban sketchers, which is nature journaling.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of people really getting into that too these
Right.
days, and a lot of that is observing nature and the world around you, which I think is really important too, and that helps people open their eyes to the world that they're living in a way
100%. I
that,
love that.
we all have phones that have cameras on them these days, but the camera is very distorted too.
Mhm. True. Yeah.
And if you're doing anything where you're trying to observe like how many legs a insect has, I mean, or any kind of animal, like if you're a centipede or something like that, you may not, or how many toes something has, from observation. If sometimes watching it move is really essential to being able to figure out how to draw it.
Well, and all of us who draw, I mean,
Hmm.
I have the experience always, time and time again, that I think I've observed something, but I don't
Hmm.
really observe it till I sit and start drawing it. And
Yes.
suddenly I notice things like, wow, I didn't notice that texture. I didn't notice that there was this thing right behind it. Or, it's such a different mind shift that
Yes.
suddenly we're taking in information that we just sort of dismissed. It's fascinating.
And I've noticed you have a lot of beautiful places out there to sketch. You
Oh yeah,
go around to
very
a
lucky.
lot of the parks and
Hmm.
Joshua Tree, and now your sketching in the car is really interesting. Are you tell me a little bit more about your sketches in the car because I love them.
Well, that's where I tell people, they say, how do you do it? Well, I say I started with that cheap pen from Staples and the little tiny square handbooks I used to buy there when
I love
you'd
those.
go
I
in.
have those too.
Yes, those are some of the first that used to show up in all the art stores. And I'd get the little square one and I'd just do anytime we were on the road. And of course, I'm not driving when I do
Hmm.
this. Always make sure because people always ask, were you driving?
Well, I figured
No,
that like
no,
you
no,
had
no.
you were a passenger.
I was the passenger. I do call them passenger sketches, yes. But I just discovered what a great way to practice just how quickly can you get down information onto a page and make it sort of make sense. And it forces what we would call an expressive line because that's, what you have time for. And I just started filling those little books. I have tons of them. I have not thrown any of them away. I have dozens of them. And just for a long time, maybe the first year or two, that's all I did was just the cheap Staples pen and line drawing. And then it's like, well, longer trips, maybe I'll try adding a little bit of watercolor, And it was only recently, aha, why didn't I think of this before? I got one of those lap tables, that
Oh,
has the
nice,
cushion on the
nice.
bottom,
Yes.
and I have the little uh, Velcro that I can stick my palette on. And so it's like all these years I was sort of doing this in my lap and would have like the side pocket of the car door would be where I'd be holding my tools. And so it's just easier now that I finally did this thing that makes sense. So, but it's really, I like the challenge of if it's a short drive, how much information can I get down? It's
Hmm.
always easiest on those long drives where the landscape, especially going to the desert,
Hmm.
where the landscape doesn't change as quickly.
Hmm.
And so I noticed I could practice all kinds of things like identify the horizon line, look for the converging lines, look for how, all those things that I also like to teach and pay attention to, the cues of depth. You see all those when you're a passenger and how quickly can you convey that? You notice the intervals of things like telephone poles, the lines for the white lines, the yellow line. Oh, there's all these things that you notice something happens when you're driving at a certain speed that you get to observe. And that's part of the fun and the memory of how quickly can I remember something that I can record.
Hmm.
So that's sometimes where when things get very elaborate and layered, that's just, memory practice and of course interpretation.
Yes, yes, that's so exciting. And how often, I mean, you have so many beautiful places to draw around there. Is your practice you kind of do something every day, whether you're in your yard or driving somewhere?
There was a time when I literally drew every day. I
Hmm.
try to do that. If I go more than a few days, I really feel it. I mean, if
Hmm.
God forbid I were to go a week without drawing, I feel almost as if I have to relearn how to draw. And I do notice I have students all the time who say, well, it's so hard for me to do this. And I know from my own practice, if you can do something, try to do
Hmm.
something every day, even if it's a doodle. I'm
Hmm.
not out on location every day, but I do something and I don't post everything I draw. But
Oh,
I'm
totally. Yes.
drawing something because I have to that hand to the eye to hand connection. It's like playing, I mean, I tell people it's like just like playing a musical instrument,
It
you know.
is. It
And
is.
musicians notice, if they go a day without practice, they notice it. Maybe their audience doesn't notice it, but after a week, the audience might notice. But it's like something I have to do every day to keep that feeling of being in tune. And I still have bad days. And that's the other thing. Sometimes it's just a bad day and you just have to say, I'm moving on.
Yes, yes, we all have bad days. I mean, I find sketching every day does really help my illustration practice a lot. And I think a lot of it is the observation and being able to capture things the way you want to capture them. But we've talked for almost an hour, if you can believe it. Um, before we go, I want to know what was your favorite thing you worked on Mattel? What was your favorite product line? Or is there something in
Oh,
particular? That's one thing they never really ask on all your interviews. And I'm probably the most geeky person you're talking to because of being, having worked on, I've worked on several different product lines. And I'm just curious on if there's one you're particularly excited about or proud of.
oh gosh. I don't know if there's any one, but I always think the two kinds of things that I loved doing the most were character design
Mm-hmm.
and you might say environment design. I loved working on castles. Anytime,
Oh,
and I got
nice.
to where as a freelancer, I seem to get a lot of that because once you've done that, it's like you have
Mm-hmm.
some go-to ideas. Uh, I always go back to my favorite client really was Fisher Price
Oh, okay.
because I had a wonderful working relationship with them, and I loved working on their Imaginext line, and I
Uh-huh.
did a lot of the design for the play sets.
Oh,
And
how
that if
exciting.
I have to, it's funny, I didn't think of that right at first, but there was a lot of reasons why I especially enjoyed that. I always enjoyed the character design. Usually with character design, I was working at an initial stage, and then
Mm-hmm.
what it might finally look like, if it ever even got made, might have nothing to do with what I did. But when working on play sets was probably what I enjoyed the most. And especially working with Fisher Price on that Imaginext line.
Oh, that's
It just
exciting. I'll
was
have to look it up.
such yeah, it was really, they had already worked out a lot of the what does it do? And
Mm-hmm.
my job was really, to come up with the appearance and how things, to add
Mm-hmm.
to their basic idea of how it works.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that probably was what I enjoyed the most.
Were you one of those designers that actually mocks it up in foam core too, or did you just?
No, well, when I worked for Mattel, when I was still working in-house, and
Mm-hmm.
when we did, and I always enjoyed that. I was taught how to do that because I came into Mattel very much as a 2D illustrator, and I
Mm-hmm.
worked with my friend Gordon, who was very much a 3D person, and he said the sooner you get it into 3D, the better. And he taught me how to do things with foam core and cardboard, and
Mm-hmm.
that was really new for me. But once I started doing that, it was like, oh, I get it. I can immediately I could build something in a very rough way that then I could draw from because I had a three-dimensional representation and I could move it around. And I taught that to students too. I mean, I'm not the only
Yes.
one that did that, but sometimes you just have to put something together that you can draw from. And I loved actually doing those kind like making I remember making an elaborate foam core or not yeah, foam core structure for a princess castle that I
Oh, how
know
cool.
never was made in the way that I built it. But boy, did I have fun. Just like, oh, the ballroom could be here, and if it turns out this way, and it's very hard to do that in drawing. And when you
Yes, yes.
physically can, so I did enjoy that. But as a freelancer, someone else like Fisher Price would do something literally out of foam, and it
Yes.
would look like blocks. Like, here's the configuration for the package, right?
Uh-huh.
And so, what does it look like? And in some cases, they would have a rough idea. In other cases, it was pretty much up to me to give them concepts. So that was a lot of fun. And I did other things for Fisher Price too that were a little closer to the character design. And I always loved working with them. I mean, I worked for Mattel for years, a little bit more of a get it done quickly. It's a
Yes.
little more entertainment driven back then because, where we are. With Fisher Price, this was a little bit different way of thinking. And I enjoyed that a lot.
Oh, that's really cool. And what are your socials so people can find you?
Well, I'm on Instagram and Virginia Hein, so
Hmm.
not too hard to figure that one out. And so that's mainly that. And then I am working on a website, and it is up, but it's definitely under construction, and it's pretty much V Hein Studio or Virginia Hein Studio. But again, it's on FASO, that web host, but it's going to take me a while to get it fully up and running. But in the meantime, I do post regularly on Instagram.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. Thanks so much.
No, wonderful to talk to you. Really a lot of fun.